Ok. Yara?
Boa tarde, pessoal. Gostaria de, em nome do Departamento de Relações Internacionais, agradecer a presença de todos na nossa aula inaugural e do nosso professor, que muito gentilmente aceitou o convite, professor Robert Vitalis, da Universidade da Pensilvânia. É uma honra tê-lo aqui conosco, considerando toda a produção acadêmica que já realizou ao longo dos últimos anos, engrandecendo enormemente o campo das relações internacionais. E o seu último livro, né, de título semelhante da palestra que ouviremos hoje, né, ele foi muito bem conceituado, inclusive, né, foi vencedor do prêmio Pulitzer. E um dos comentários críticos recebido pelo livro, que ele é indispensável para compreender o momento atual, mostrando que ir além dos combustíveis fósseis é mais semelhante a abandonar uma seita do que abandonar um vício. Sua pesquisa atual enfoca a seção da militância de direita nos estudos estratégicos nos Estados Unidos e todo o seu desdobramento. Gostaria de agradecer a presença do professor Péricles, coordenador do curso de Poços de Caldas, juntamente com a professora Mariana Balau, que nos assiste pelo canal, o professor Vinícius, que participará também de Poços de Caldas, que participará do debate após o encerramento da palestra do professor Vitalis, o professor Leonardo, agradeço profundamente pela condução de todo o processo, pelo diálogo, facilitação e organização do evento. Gostaria de agradecer a professora Raquel, que está também atual coordenadora da praça, enquanto a professora Daniela Sestes cumpre a sua licença maternidade, que também está nos assistindo pelo canal. E deixo aqui também meu registro de agradecimento, né, à equipe do CSC, do Sem Serviço Carreira, que auxilia o departamento em vários assuntos, inclusive, principalmente na organização da nossa programação da disciplina seminários, e inclusive, né, da nossa aula Magna. E registro aqui que essa é a primeira aula Magna que o departamento realiza, envolvendo ao mesmo tempo, né, os alunos da Praça da Liberdade e de Poços de Caldas e Coração Eucarístico, turnos manhã e tarde. Então, é uma alegria muito grande, né, ser prestigiado pelas 3 unidades, né, e essa vejo agora como uma grande vantagem do regime remoto, né, poder compartilhar momentos como esse, né, de forma que a gente tenha aqui no nosso canal, né, a presença, e agradeço, né, ao mesmo tempo, a presença dos alunos da Praça da Liberdade, os alunos de Poço e os nossos alunos do Coração Eucarístico. So, I'm pleased to introduce to you Professor Robert Vitalis, who is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. We are, Professor Vitalis, we are very delighted with the opportunity to listen to you this afternoon. And, sorry, on behalf of the Department of International Relations at PUC Minas and our students, I would like to thank you for joining us today. So
it's a gift. Thank you. I'm going to get my screen going. So let's see if this works.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And are we good? So are we good? Can you see my screen? It's an honor to be addressing you tonight. These are strange times for professors and students both. I'm pretty sure that Professor Ramos invited me because in 2015, I published a book titled White World Order, Black Power Politics, The Birth of American International Relations. In it, I sought to upend the story professors in international relations in the United States tell about themselves, the story they like to tell about themselves. And instead, I demonstrated how deeply enmeshed the discipline of IR was in imperialism and the racism that infected all quarters of American life. In other words, the academy was no different, and especially the international relations part of the academy was no different from the rest of American society. Of course, that is not how professors think about themselves. The second thing I tried to do was to recover the work of those African American scholars who opposed or challenged IR's commitment to white supremacy. Those scholars have since been written out of the discipline's history. I tried to bring them back into the view. Now, in the conclusion of that book, right, this was a historical account, going up only to about 1963. But in the conclusion of that book, I argued that we might still have something to learn from those critical scholars, Black scholars, because racism was an unacknowledged component of what today scholars and policymakers both refer to as geopolitics. So tonight, what I want to do is lay out the argument in my new book, Oilcraft, the myths of scarcity and security that haunt U.S. energy policy, because that's where I sought to flesh out this claim. Although the research took me or led me to some unexpected conclusions, which I think might cause some of you some discomfort. So I'm looking forward to a discussion here. So what I'm inviting you all to do for a minute is to think about how you understand the role of oil in international relations. Think what role oil plays, say, in the massive presence of U.S. troops since 1990, and what role U.S. air and naval bases in the Persian Gulf play today, okay? I want you to think about that. But I also want you, so what's your answer to that question? Conjure that in your head, but also I want to invite you to think, how do you know what you do know? Where did you learn this? Okay. So you might read that title, the first word, Oilcraft, and think, I get it. Vitalis is using a variant on statecraft, one that recognizes the centrality of oil to national security or to U.S. power and the like, the way so-called specialists in U.S. foreign policy, journalists, and public intellectuals imagine and repeat like a mantra, right? So as if it were statecraft. But that's not what I mean. Rather, I mean it as an analog to witchcraft. I believe this helps us really understand this infamous photo. Now look, European and American men of science once believed in witches. The scientists, say Sir Francis Bacon for one, were sure that witches existed, and they acted on this basis even though we know they don't. And we have a hard time understanding how people could have believed this. Now, you may also believe that the analogy between oilcraft and witchcraft is outrageous and unfair. Surely our modern, rational, social, scientific, and secular world and its beliefs about oil as special, the lifeblood of civilization and so forth, this is a very different kettle of fish, very different. So if you think that, let me try another example for you. Take race. Here's a photo of another book, not by me, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, published in 1920. This book, in fact, you could read it today and think it captures something about at least the way the mindsets of people in the Trump administration and elsewhere. Now, the puzzle for Karen and Barbara Fields, and those are the two sisters I show you there, sitting on either side of my old colleague, Adolph Reed Jr., the puzzle for the Fields is how and why the scientifically discredited, utterly false idea that humans are naturally divided into distinct groups identifiable by certain physical and other traits, how does this persist? Why do we continue to believe in the reality of races as a biological phenomenon? They consider it a kind of magical thinking or imagining that people find impossible to let go of. These two people, for example. Now, racecraft is the term the Fields coined for the rational processes of reasoning that make race appear to the mind and imagination as a vivid truth. Sorry, I went too fast there. The terrain of these false beliefs exists and can be analyzed both in their own terms and importantly in terms of the work these ideas do, right? So the ideas exist and have effects, okay, even though races don't exist.
We're not seeing the slides. I think that they're not. It seems that your PowerPoint presentation are not passing to us.
None of the images are showing?
No, we're seeing just the first oil craft of the hunting, the same that you're seeing here.
So you can't see racecraft here?
No, just seeing the black present, the first present, the aircraft and the hunting of U.S. energy policy.
Oh, really? So let's think about how to proceed. How about we just stop with the slides and I'll talk to you?
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to stop my screen. I'm here. So we'll go without the images because you just have to look at me, if that's okay. So where I was, the fields are asking what does the work of these false ideas about race do at the present time? Okay, and their main argument is the role that racism plays, if you want, or race, in the continuing legitimacy of inequality. So in my book, Oilcraft, I argue that what is true about the idea of race and its relationship to the mental terrain of racecraft is also true about the magical properties that oil, an ordinary commodity, accrues as it transits through what I call oilcraft territory. Okay, so that is widespread popular beliefs about oil and the so-called need to control it. That's how we used to talk about it. We need to control oil. Or now how do administrations talk about it? We need to secure access or stabilize prices or prevent hostile powers from holding the world economy hostage. These also have no basis in fact. People believe those ideas perhaps and act on them, but there's no reason to. Okay. Sure, we find U.S. officials, past and present, proclaiming about these matters. Journalists believe them. Books get written. As the fields argue, real actions create evidence for the imagined thing and constantly dumps factitious evidence for itself into the real world. And so what I am so struck by is how uncritically so many theorists, Michael Clares, the David Harveys, the Noam Chomskys, and forget the theorists, the pundits like Walter Russell Mead or Tom Friedman, or the left, what I call the left provocateurs at the present time, Phyllis Bennis of the Institute of Policy Studies, or Medea Benjamin, who started the organization Code Pink, and also historians, the Andrew Basoviches and the Daniel Yergins and the Irene Genzers and so forth, how uncritical they are when they come upon these claims about oil and strategic needs to control and so forth. So when they come upon these claims, or they make them themselves. And what I'm struck by is how infrequently these ideas are probed and challenged. Instead, they're taken for granted and assumed that is what the government has been up to. Nonetheless, the ideas that are at the core of most understandings of oil and international relations today are as plausible or as credible as the racist ideas that once animated anthropology, sociology, political science, history, and so forth. In fact, and here's one of the arguments about racism mattering, in fact, they share some origin points in common with scientific racism. So in the hands of the professors, politicians, and public intellectuals, oilcraft is an equivalently pseudoscientific discourse that many believe unquestionably true, much as they once believed that black people would die out in the north of the United States, or that mulattoes could not produce fertile offspring. The pseudoscientific beliefs of racism in the early to mid 20th century and beyond. I'm saying our ideas about oil are equivalently factitious. Okay, and as with the folk beliefs disguised as biological science and racism, right? So racism is these kind of folk beliefs, but this in a pseudoscientific garb, a biological garb. Oilcraft depends on a kind of folk geology. The misapprehension of the stock of the resource is fixed, which underpinned the kind of revitalization of a mercantilist framework that was applied to problems of international politics. It made no sense back in the early 20th century, as critics at that time argued, but what I'm struck by is how little effect those critics had at the time. Now, I know this has been a lot to take in, so let me illustrate with an anecdote before going on to discuss the major variants or schools of magical thinking about oil that circulates among environmentalists, generals, self-described energy security experts. And these ideas are believed in and repeated despite the implausibility and the lack of supporting evidence. So I would put up an image now, if I could, of two of my colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania in 2014 in a lunchtime roundtable on developments in Syria and Iraq back at the time. So think it's 2014. What are people talking about? That's the moment of ISIS, the Islamic State. So I have two colleagues, one, and they rarely agreed on anything, but during the question and answer period, they agreed on, they found rare common ground. So an audience member asked about the problem that Saudi Arabia's support for jihadists posed for the Obama administration's policy. Okay, you remember those days, right? Obama administration is trying to end the rule of ISIS, but Saudi Arabia, our ally, we understand, are funding Sunni jihadists. So this is where my colleagues come in. One answers first, and that one was a specialist and frequent UN consultant on power sharing. He said, when I quote him, "The sad thing about this is fracking is the best means of weakening Saudi influence." Right? This was the midst of the fracking revolution inside the United States at the same time, so-called, right? And my colleague said, the green side of me is against this, doesn't appreciate this, doesn't approve of it, but I prefer fracking to being dependent on the Saudis, okay? Then my colleague, and usual protagonist of my other colleague, in an expert on the Israeli-Palestine conflict and member of Council on Foreign Relations, he doubled down on the same argument. He said shale increased oil production at home, and he insisted that that produced new leverage over the Saudis. So here's the point of this. It would seem that my two colleagues believe there are costs that something called dependency on Saudi Arabia exacts on the United States. And many people have held that up, from the 1973 so-called oil crisis on. So as the cliche from the 1970s imagines it, the Saudis have had Americans over a barrel for some time now. And you could Google that phrase and you will find many cartoons of oil barrels, Uncle Sam, and so forth. Now, if the audience members that day in 2014, I wasn't there, if they're like most Americans, or at least like the undergraduates who take my classes, then their claims would have reinforced the widely held but utterly false belief that U.S. refineries get sizable quantities of their crude oil supplies from the kingdom in other Persian Gulf states, or that they ever did. Right? It's hard to understand what else dependency could mean. Yet the largest share continues to come from the Western Hemisphere, as was the case throughout the 20th century. So roughly around now, the actual value of Gulf imports for the past decade ranged between 10 and 15% of total crude imports. And roughly over that same period, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and Venezuela were tied and right behind Canada and Mexico as suppliers. Now, assume my colleagues know these facts, that in fact, not much oil has ever been coming from Saudi Arabia, or that most exports are still coming from the Western Hemisphere. Assume that my colleagues knew these facts, but had no time to go into detail. It would then appear that in one case, dependency obliges, this is their point, the dependency on Saudi Arabia obliges the administration to tolerate the Saudi government's aiding anti-Assad jihadis in Syria, or bombing Yemeni civilians today, or spreading radical Salafist beliefs everywhere. While, let's consider another case, Venezuela, the same level of import dependency posed no insurmountable challenge to seeking the overthrow of the country's leader. We're stuck with Saudi Arabia. We get just as much oil from Venezuela, but that has not had any impact on decisions to try to unseat the government and cause further disruption and create sanctions and so forth. Let's just say that the bad news for all of those who dream a Saudi oil-free future for the United States sooner rather than later, or who imagine that Washington's leverage with Saudi frenemies goes up as the quantity of imports from Tehran goes down, is that some elementary features of the world markets and the refinery industries have to be wished away. Okay, and we can talk about this more if you like when I'm done with this presentation. But now let's stop for a second, because you have an excellent opportunity to learn more about oilcraft's power over you. By resisting the train of thought, at least some of you are setting off on, as a consequence of my questioning the validity of this venerable piece of folk geopolitics, right? So the first answer is always the U.S. must be dependent on Saudi Arabia for its oil. Now, you either know that that's not true, or you've just been thrown a curveball, but you now start the brain starts spinning. Okay, if it's not that, then you have other answers for what connects why oil is so important, right? That is, you already know the empirical problem with the idea of U.S. dependency, and you have an alternative answer worked out, or else you're beginning to scramble to think of one. The reason I can say this is I've been talking about this for some time now, and I have witnessed numerous interlocutors at this point hop from one idea, right, the idea of import dependency, to claims about Saudi Arabia being a price stabilizer in the market, the swing producer, or in some way, other way, attempt to solve for oil in the much believed in, yet utterly factitious idea that the United States has a deal with Saudi Arabia, one that trades oil for security. Okay, and that's repeated all the time. It's a myth that's entered into a discourse in the United States and elsewhere around the world after 9/11. But that deal is said to go all the way back to 1945. Okay, now here's what's tricky about all this. United States Persian Gulf force projection has cost about as much as the entire Cold War. So the United States is spending as much in using the Fifth Fleet and Central Command in the Persian Gulf as we spent on the Cold War. And in any year exceeds the value of all exports from the region to the rest of the world. Okay, so we're spending more to be in the Persian Gulf than than consumers or refiners are paying for all exports of oil from the Persian Gulf. A huge amount more. In other words, what U.S. taxpayers pay for the elusive good called energy security exceeds what U.S. refiners pay for oil imported from the region by an order of magnitude. So according to one analyst, Roger Stern, I'm quoting him there, it's a fancy way of saying that one bill is 10 times or more higher than the other. Okay, the bill for energy security is 10 times higher than the bill for all the energy that's being bought from the Persian Gulf. Okay, so now let's go to international relations theory, okay? And I'm going to advance thought, that's what I'm going to call advanced thought in these fields. Advanced thought as represented by one or another school or paradigm in academic international relations in the United States, right? If we go to those, higher order thinking, you would conclude that my colleagues approached the question, right, the one about Saudi dependency, wearing the wrong analytical lenses. Okay, so for many, the quantity of imports flowing from the kingdom and nearby producers to eastern seaboard and Gulf Coast ports, that really explains little. That's not really allegedly what the U.S. strategic posture is all about. Now, alternative conceptualizations tend to cluster nearer to one or the other of two rival visions, right? So in one vision in IR, we live in a more violent and anarchical and confrontational world, right? Versus another vision in IR where we live in a more tameable, cooperative system of states. What I'm saying is these two schools of thought have two different explanations for what the United States oil security relation really is about. And I'm about to tell you that neither of those make sense as well. Right in the one, and I have an image here of, choke points, geostrategic, vulnerable sites in the world map of geopolitics, right? For those folks, the expanded U.S. military presence is driven by the need, allegedly, to prevent present or future enemies from gaining control of and potentially denying access to this scarce and vital oil resources on which the defense of the homeland rests. Not so for all those who understand the U.S. strategic posture as the liberal Leviathan, or at least it once was the liberal Leviathan. We don't know what's happening right now. So I'm thinking about the most visible person thinking in those terms today is John Eikenberry at Princeton University. So for someone like John Eikenberry, oil is the key factor, or the United States is the key factor in the relative stability that makes global oil trade at relatively inexpensive prices possible in the first place, given, from his viewpoint, the myriad potential sources of disruption to the lifeblood of advanced and developing capitalist industrial societies. Okay? So that's, the right wing in international relations thought and the liberal wing in international relations thought. But then we have the comrades of mine on the left who conventionally excise, take out the idea of liberal in the concept of hegemony to tell an old and venerable story about the role of oil in the U.S. exercise of imperialist power. Oil is, in this story, central to the motivations of imperialism and so forth. That is, behind the rhetoric of access, the United States really either seeks to gain or is now exercising or is struggling to preserve its control of Middle East oil resources. Now, it's no surprise that you rarely find analysts in this camp seeking to demonstrate how the United States actually exercises some kind of overarching power over oil, price, or supply, because the few that have done that, rather than just take it for granted as a common sense, the few that have done that have come up empty-handed. They cannot demonstrate this in any falsifiable way, this idea about control by the United States. So my book puts forward three axioms that, taken together, go far in falsifying all the overblown analyses, journalism, punditry, and history writing about oil and strategy. So here's the first axiom, if you want. In a market filled with buyers and sellers, everyone has access. Okay. Now, I know most of you watching this were not alive in 1973. Probably no one watching this besides me was alive in 1973 during the time of the oil crisis. And that's probably significant because if you weren't there and haven't continued to study it, you're really just a victim, I guess I would say, of the myths that have emerged about it, okay? So consider those hazily remembered days now, right, of the so-called energy crisis that supposedly transformed the world economy. That's when the United States began selling advanced arms both to the Shah of Iran and the Saudi government, with the Saudi government allegedly, being among the so-called boycotters of the United States. And they were starting to sell arms to both these folks in order to secure regional stability and preserve access, okay? Now, we could spend an hour, 2 hours actually, just on the things people have come to believe about the so-called oil crisis of 1973. Most of it is fiction. But it is when the Massachusetts Institute of Technology economist Morris Edelman, tried to bring reason back into the discussion. So as the so-called crisis was unfolding in the United States and the gas lines were emerging, Morris Edelman stepped in and sort of said, hey, you folks are crazy. In peacetime, markets guarantee buyers access without the need for force. He argued that even if the Saudis were embargoing the United States, and they went on to embargo Portugal, the Netherlands, Rhodesia, and South Africa, though people have these crazy ideas that there was an embargo all around the world, the US and its allies, Japan and Western Europe, nothing like that happened. But Morris Edelman argued that the Saudis can't, or any other oil producer cannot embargo one country or two countries or three countries without opting, right, without shutting down production to all countries. That was the only way an embargo would work effectively, if they just stopped producing oil. And what do we know about this? No state, of course, including Saudi Arabia, has ever opted to keep all its oil in the ground rather than to sell it for the goods, services, prisons, palaces, weapons, and so on that the oil revenues buy. So Morris Edelman argued that the embargo couldn't work. The data we have, as opposed to our hazy memories of the moment, suggests that the embargo did not work. The Saudis were actually selling oil all the time to the major U.S. consumer of oil at that time, the U.S. military, then persecuting the war in Vietnam. And any production shortfall was made up by other sellers in the world market and by the redistribution of oil across countries. So if Saudi Arabia starts cutting back production, guess what? Iran was happy to increase production and sold more and more oil to the United States, as did some radical countries, Iraq, for instance, okay? Now, I've traced this idea of this like kind of fear of being cut off from oil back to the 1920s. But keep in mind that back then, oil had not yet come to be seen as exceptional. Quite the opposite. All raw materials and natural resources were imagined as vital, and in fact were the explanation people offered up for either colonialism, right, in order to secure access to these raw materials of all kinds, and for some that led the need that led to World War I and so forth. Now, if we move ahead to the 1950s and 60s, again, none of you were around them, but you could read the history books. There were many radical critics of the Vietnam War in the United States, and arguing that the U.S. is there fighting in Vietnam to get raw materials. Or there were the conservative think tanks in the United States advocating for the U.S. to quit supporting decolonization and recognize the vital need of the colonies in supporting the needs of civilization. This was a standard argument in the United States in the 1950s. We can't afford to decolonize because we need the raw material resources. And those folks in Africa and Asia and Latin America, Venezuela, cannot be counted on to produce the goods, produce the resources we need, the West, civilization, and so forth. Okay. Now, it's only with the oil crisis of 1973, and I think of it as a kind of psychological trauma in the United States, whose impact we are still feeling today, that oil takes on the magical status it has today. So we don't talk about the vital need for raw materials of all kinds, scrap metal, copper, tin, rubber, and so forth. It's as if oil is the one thing countries have been fighting for the most of the 20th century, okay? And so all the histories of those earlier decades have gotten rewritten to reflect this. So now people look back at the conflicts over oil in the early 20th century, not over rubber. So, okay, so axiom 1, there was no need to do anything in a market of buyers and sellers. You have access, okay? You don't need to fear embargoes and so forth. On to the second axiom, a more recent one. Another MIT professor, Barry Posen, the head of the Institute's Security Studies program and a consultant to the Defense Department, he follows in Adelman's footsteps, I argue. That is, Barry Posen has called for a radical rethinking of what he calls the unnecessary, counterproductive, costly, and wasteful global spanning strategic posture and military force structure in Europe, Asia, and the Persian Gulf. His argument is the United States does not need to have the Fifth Fleet in the Persian Gulf, okay? And he argues that, and the argument goes on in that he includes in this case, revisionist case, he says there's no need, he includes in this any effort now or in the future to preserve the current Saudi government in power. So here's a strategic defense intellectual arguing we don't need to have the military presence we have in the Persian Gulf, and there's no need to preserve the Saudis themselves in power if what you care about is access to oil, okay? That is, after working through the set of routinely evoked claims that ostensibly justify the military presence, again, the presumed vulnerability of transit routes, the threat of a future Saddam Hussein-like figure who would raise prices or withhold supply in the minds of some, he concludes that the threats and benefits that are usually invoked are not compelling. They're either not true, or those threats that do exist cannot be dealt with efficiently by military power. And I think what he's got in mind is there's no way the Fifth Fleet is going to be able to prevent internal instability of the kind, say, that led to the overthrow of the Shah in 1979. Okay. Now, and also, I've been able to find analogs of Barry Posen's argument, okay, back to the end of World War II. Okay. Posen thinks that since the results of a cost-benefit analysis are both straightforward and inescapable, there must be some other, and he calls it factor X, that explains the enormity of the sums expended when the flow of oil itself has never been seriously at risk. Okay, you got that? We're there expending these enormous sums, and there's really been no risk to the flow of oil at the same time. And so I quote what this factor X in his mind is. I suspect that global prestige and influence is the factor X. The United States is there, right, somehow because it can be there, and the hegemon has to be there, something like that. And so that everyone is like kind of impressed by this wielding of power and so forth. But it's done nothing to secure oil flows for anyone, okay? Now he says, now first, if you think about that, that is close to what my comrades mean when they talk about U.S. hegemony, in some sense. But Posen says, even this argument is not self-evidently strong. That is, you know, our allies or would-be enemies really awestruck by this exertion of power in some sense, right? So that is, or to put it another way, it's impossible to account for that capacity in any kind of tangible way. So what has the United States done by the exercise of this hegemonic power? Can we show, for instance, that that it's led to discounted prices that refiners pay, that has led to additional quantities shipped or extra reserves that so-called big oil claims on its book as a result of decades of force projection? Now, beware those who claim that the issue is more complicated but don't specify how. So Posen says, if it is global prestige and influence that strategists and activists believe the U.S. Navy delivers, well, I'm sorry, I said that's Posen, but this is me. So if it's global prestige and influence that is what the U.S. Navy actually delivers, well, that to me sounds just like another strategic rationale, as IR people say. The equivalent of, say, there's no difference between that, it as an ideational phenomenon, than ideas about civilizing missions, right, or democracy promotion, or falling dominoes and the like. And if you think about analysts on the left who have always argued that every one of those things are rationalizations for something much more material and strategic, and typically that more material and strategic thing is oil, but Posen is sort of saying it's actually as ideational, as unreal as all these other things, or as real as. There's no difference. Okay. Now, oil is different, or so many believe, but is that claim true? Okay, sure. Historians will continue to mine the archives for evidence that behind the rhetoric of securing the free world in the Cold War, that oil preoccupied the principles in some event or crisis. And we can find evidence of that. Iran in 1951, say, 73, and so forth. Noam Chomsky has been quoting for 30 years or more a statement in a kind of declassified U.S. document that talks about, the enormous strategic power of oil and why the U.S. needs to control it. Okay, but they find those things, but you never see them questioning the rationality of policymakers' beliefs, and not least their own about the thing itself. They don't question it because they believe it themselves, okay? Now, finally, for many policymakers and analysts, the United States is a uniquely stabilizing force in the market for the world's most vital commodity. Absent U.S. primacy, the argument goes, supply and therefore price would be that much more volatile. Posen encapsulates the view of which he is quite skeptical as follows. The guardianship of the United States military since the 1980s has preserved order, guaranteed supply against political shock, and so has underwritten the price that all consumers pay. Although, he adds, he has seen no evidence of this benefit. There's none, okay? There is just believed, reproduced, articulated, maybe even acted upon, but without kind of empirical verification of the thing. And that's because there isn't any evidence. To the contrary, all these accounts of oil's unique strategic value, driving the politics of intervention, or of a potent oil weapon that the Saudi leaders wield alone or as part of OPEC. And for the left, OPEC is for some people on the left, the Saudis are really puppets of the United States and doing all this for, selling oil for the United States and so forth, or of the gains from the United States efforts on behalf of refiners and consumers. Well, all these beliefs in oil as special founder, if we compare the volatility of oil prices with that of all other more humdrum commodities bought and sold on the world market. And I was in a webinar yesterday in Abu Dhabi where we were talking about OPEC and oil prices. And, I pointed out my third axiom to my colleagues. And that axiom is that until now, through the 20th century and until now, the prices of all raw materials rise and fall in tandem. Okay, that's true before oil was discovered in the Middle East. That is when the British strategic presence had already been established there, not before. It's true during the heyday of British primacy, in the era when the Western oil giants are said to have controlled prices, an idea that Maury Edelman demonstrated to be false. It's true about the time of low U.S. involvement, and since the 1970s, it's true of the era of unrivaled American hegemony in the region. Okay, oil prices go up and down the same way as all other commodities. Now, if you think about it, we read on the front pages of newspapers, when OPEC is, or when Saudi Arabia is allegedly, kind of seeking to punish the Russians, or when the Russians and OPEC finally come together for OPEC plus, and we think it's oil prices are changing because of that. But the prices of all those other commodities are changing, are going up and down at the same time. And we don't think about any kind of cartel or anything, so-called cartel, so OPEC isn't one, but we don't think about actors shaping those prices, right? And the best we could say is that in certain moments, but very few moments actually, the best we could say is that it might be that concerted actions have reduced the height of the price rise or limited the reduction of the price rise. But if you want, the major determinant of prices are macroeconomic activities, just like every other, just as demand is for every other commodity. It's not the concerted action of the Saudis, et cetera, somehow, on their own, wielding, how about this, determining to 100%, or explaining all the variance in the price of oil or the volatility of oil, okay? So I would say conclude is that all that blood and treasure spent on the so-called prize hasn't mattered a bit, at least not in the way that most experts and citizens, consumers and activists, and yes, even many presidents and generals, let alone the professors, imagine. So, basically I conclude that oil, like race, doesn't exist, not at least not as a thing over which states have fought numerous wars over the century. And folks, make this claim all the time that, countries have gone to war all the time over oil. And if you investigate that carefully, you'll see that it's patently not true. Okay, or that oil for which a stable market cannot exist absent the deployment of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Okay, that in the hands of an enemy, it might be used to bring the advanced capitalist economies to their knees, and that therefore needs to be secured, controlled for the industrial world, or more narrowly, the U.S. hegemons, or more narrowly still, as the left still thinks today, big oil's benefit. Right, it's big oil that the U.S. is acting for. And so the idea of access to oil, which animates so much of what the U.S. does in the world, is no less culturally constituted than any other dimension of policy. It takes a great deal of work, in fact, to make control of oil or access to oil both tangible and commonsensical. Its materiality is a mirage. And to return to my analogy with racism, today we generally don't stress so much. Think about this. We don't generally stress so much about what those who were responsible for the creation of the Jim Crow system or apartheid said or thought. We don't look at the ideas anymore that justified, the era of segregation and racial inequality, right? We don't care much about what they believed about the inherent superiority of some and the inferiority of others. I mean, we only care about it to the extent that people still articulate views like that as lunatic as it was back in the, for all of the 20th century, right? We give the ideas themselves at best cursory treatment, unless you're an intellectual historian or trying to figure out where those ideas come from or how those ideas were superseded, how the critique gained ground. What do we do instead? Instead of focusing on the ideas, we think about what would the effects of these ideas false as they were, okay, as unmoored in science as they were. And those effects are not always or often necessarily the ones that those who held the beliefs imagined or not to be true. So, separation of the races in the United States and the views of those who held those beliefs secured the continued greatness of the dominant race by protecting genes from contamination, they said, and degradation, right? But now we talk about the impact segregation had, for instance, on dividing the labor movement in the United States, on reducing wages and so forth, when folks write about racial capitalism. And in a book I wrote in 2007, I showed how the Americans, when they came to Saudi Arabia, constructed the same kind of segregated system inside the oil camps. And the reason they did that, there was a long tradition of doing so, which was if you divided your labor force by race, you reduced the likelihood of strikes that would increase the costs of production, et cetera, okay? So we talk about the impact segregation had, but not the ideas that animated it. So what I'm saying here is that old ideas about scarcity and conflict, rooted in 19th century social Darwinism, neo-mercantilism, geographical determinism, and scientific racism. And what I show in the book is all these ideas about either the Venezuelans not being able to produce oil, or this idea that the United States must occupy places because Arabs would not, Arabs would either not produce the oil or were incapable of doing so, or would, were hell-bent on wreaking revenge on, in Americans' minds, they're wreaking revenge on them for their own racial reasons, right? All those things proved false. Okay, 1973 came. Mexico nationalized its oil fields way before. In 1930s, virtually all oil-producing countries have nationalized their oil production, and oil continued to flow quite nicely. Okay. Well, all those ideas are impossible to disentangle from the imperialism of that era, right? In the early 20th century and so forth. And those ideas have a long half-life. They win votes, right? For Americans, many Americans supported the war in 2003 in Iraq, thinking that somehow was going to help them keep having cheap gas, right? And the same, alternately, the opposition, right, opposed the Iraq war on grounds, right, no war for oil, right? So they can win votes for oil, or they can mobilize the opposition. Security of oil, justify arms sales, and President Trump is the arms seller, supreme. And those arms sales guarantee the weapons makers' bottom lines. And they also subsidize the cost that the Pentagon pays for its own purchases. So we often forget this, and I learned it myself when I was in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, in the late 1990s, when an arms dealer, a vice president of McDonnell Douglas, explained that the Saudis buy all these weapons that they can't use and don't need, and they do that as a gift to the Pentagon because it reduces, right? If the assembly lines are humming, right, and there are lots of orders, it reduces the unit cost for the Pentagon in buying its arms itself. Okay. What else happens? Well, all that talk about oil smooths the way for government transfer of public wealth into private hands, right? The recycling of petrodollars and so forth. The world still pays for Gulf oil in dollars. And Saudi petrodollars flow into U.S. finance and real estate markets. Okay, there are many other effects we can talk about. It's just that the ideas themselves aren't true. Thanks.
Thanks, Professor Vitalis. It was a very, very interesting presentation. Unfortunately, I did not read yet your new book, but I read some some comments. I read some pics that you published on some days, and it seems to me a very, very interesting point was, as you told today and you told on your notes, this raw material interpretation of the oil to U.S. foreign policy, and to think about 9/11 after, it's very, very common in the left. Let's see, you talk about the Harvey New imperialism, but I remember also other discussions. Maybe it's the discussion concerning in my research, this discussion, or to my research, this discussion is very, very interesting. Once it leads me to think more properly about the hegemonic construction and things concerning this, as John Agnew told, the statecraft discourses, the statecraft elite. And so I think it's very, very interesting. And how, including, for example, we have some an interesting question here concerning concerning this point that you made. For example, the impact of the cryptocurrency in this process, the oil being traded using cryptocurrency, fleeing from sanctions from the US, for example, in the case of Libyan oil, if it has some impact or not, or maybe not impact in material world, but impact on ideas concerning how this can unstabilize this discourse. And the other is from the material, but I think that's a very, very important geopolitical topic, contemporary geopolitical topic, which is the relationship, the recent agreement between China and Iran. What do you think? How do you think that this approximation with China, with Russia, and now China with Iran could impact not on the market, the oil market? And I understand following your argument, but how this could impact on these ideas concerning scarcity, safety, security, and oil, and things like that.
Okay.
And then we can send you some more questions. I think that Vinicius has a question, also had a question to you, but I don't know. Maybe you want to answer this before.
Sure. Let me say, I'll just answer briefly, because I can get very excited about these things and go on for too long. First, this is what I think about Iran. Think about Iran and think about Venezuela, closer to home to you folks in some sense. The argument goes that the United States is really about securing oil flows and increasing access to oil for consumers. But the only time oil is stopped from flowing is when the United States imposes sanctions, right? So Iran is being sanctioned, Venezuela is being sanctioned. This, in theory, limits oil flows rather than maximizes oil flows. So much so that for some leftists, sophisticated leftists, they argue that's the whole idea about the United States. It's really about helping to deal with not scarcity, which is a fiction, but the problem of oversupply, and hence guaranteeing the profits of oil firms. But I think about it a different way. Or I think the fact of sanctions, right? Iraq was sanctioned until the destruction of the Ba'athist regime. Iran is being sanctioned now, and Venezuela is under sanctions. Well, what troubles American officials, right, and what those policies seem to be doing is not securing oil flows, but what drives them crazy is what the oil rents, the revenues from oil, right, the monopoly rents that states extract from selling oil on the world market, what those rents are used for. Right, so when an ally transits to enemy, right, Iran from 1979 on, Venezuela for the past 10 years or so, Iraq for all of the 1990s, right? There was the United States. The United States was getting plenty of oil from those places until it decides it doesn't want it anymore. They're going to block sales of oil. And what troubles them are the rents, the revenues, and what those revenues permit those oil states to do. So it's never been about stopping oil flows or guaranteeing oil flows, but it's the threat that wealthy countries, powerful countries that do not follow, are not part of the U.S. project, of what they pose, the problems they pose for the United States. And at the end of my book, because I follow Barry Posen in this, I say, imagine a post-Saudi Arabia. Okay, imagine, Islamic activists take over from the Al Saud. They're banished, and Saudi Arabia becomes the Islamic Emirate of Arabia. Well, what will happen? Well, the leaders of the Islamic Emirate of Arabia will be happy to sell all the oil that it can, but the U.S., all other things being equal, will impose sanctions, right, on those folks as I put it, as an ally transits to enemy, etc. So for the Chinese in Iran, they don't have the same project as the United States, and there's no reason not to support, right, the flow of oil to Asia by the Iranians. Now, I'll say one more thing about China. So if you remember back in 2000, that's a rhetorical thing. Back in 2003 and 2004, there was a kind of sophisticated variant about what the war was really about. Because at that time, oil prices had reached almost $100 a barrel, right? They were high. And the argument was, every time price goes up, Americans seem to think that the world is running out of oil. And we had analysts who would argue that really what the war was about was to control Iraqi oil resources, because the Chinese were coming to get it, right, in some sense. And that, the Chinese, since their going out strategy in the early 2000s, have been involved in oil exploration, extraction, and flows in all sorts of places. Typically, places that the Western oil companies did not think were as lucrative to invest in, but the Chinese do. And what happened to all that oil that supposedly China was trying to capture because the world was running out of oil and China would need it for its conflict with the United States? Well, 90% of the oil that Chinese refiners, Chinese state-owned oil production companies and refining companies, 90% of that oil flowed and was bought by customers outside of China. So, that whole overblown strategic nonsense, right? I don't know that we can get away from it, but it makes no sense. And I'll limit I'll stop there on the Chinese side.
Now I'll ask to Vinicius. He said this, he has some question. Let me add him.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for the talk and the book. I got the chance to start reading it, and it amazes me. But what I was thinking from the beginning of my reading was how these ideas they come up. How these ideas, either from the left or from the right wing, that oil is power or there's imperialism in the oil politics, because they don't come up out of nothing, right? There's like someone creating these ideas, and the reason and benefiting probably from them. And I was able to check the conclusion of the book, and you're writing about how the money oil can flow into U.S. companies and these kind of things. And what struck me was how if understanding where these ideas come from is important to overcome these ideas, but especially from a progressive way of seeing things, because we're losing this kind of battle from all sides. And then by reading your book, I just found out that we are losing from a side that I didn't even know we're losing, because that's what I thought was like our strong point, and then how can we overcome this? And then for the IR field itself, by embracing oilcraft, is it a problem of the theory, like some sort of wishful thinking about the oil and its power, or is it a case, just like as Jacqueline Braveboy Wagner argues, that it's just bad theory, and how should we overcome this as an academic field, or should we overcome this as an academic field? These are the concerns that I've been thinking while I was reading your book. So, and I would like to thank you again for the thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. Let's see. The ideas, I mean, it's in a short book and not a monograph for other scholars, but a book that was meant to just, engage people or ordinary folks, or written, to be accessible and to matter to the left in particular at this time. So the Wall Street Journal reviewed the book recently, and the analyst, that's a conservative publication, and the analyst, the reviewer, said Vitalis was a libertarian, right? And he I don't know about that, but he ignored everything in the book that was pointed to, or that I said was really the point of the book. So as you know, toward the end, which is, we need to reverse the militarization in the United States exercise of power everywhere under guise of securing oil flows, etc. And in order to do that, we have to undermine those arguments that keep that permit the state, right, to articulate these claims. I don't know that it's going to work, but I think it's very important to challenge the claims, right, to demonstrate that they're false. And what I show in the book was there were sets of analysts in the 1920s and 30s who did exactly that with these ideas about raw materials. Right? There were leftist Marxists who said, of course the state is doing this because, that's what capital needs to do, or the state is working hand in hand with capital. And in fact, these governments need the raw materials from their colonial possessions. And, what I showed where there were these analysts that said, that stuff makes no sense. Two things. Colonial possessions did not, in fact, guarantee commodity security for anyone during the courses of war. And then the other argument that was being made during the era of high colonialism and imperialism was that without these without control over these raw materials, right? These are British thinkers in Great Britain in the 1930s. If we give up, if decolonization happens, we'll be destroyed. Our country will collapse, etc. We need those raw materials. The natives can't produce them, etc. And all those prove false in some sense. Decolonization happened, and the commodities continued to flow. In fact, increased, and we know why, because we've studied it in studying the political economy of Brazil, Venezuela, and so forth. We needed post-independent states or developmental states sold those raw materials in order to finance the industrialization projects that they had that were so significant in order to get the foreign exchange they needed and so forth. So for me, it's important to challenge these ideas, and they are so deeply entrenched, right? My book isn't about what governments do, but what but what intellectuals think the government is doing, and why, and I try to show why those arguments don't matter. And it's remarkable to me because these ideas, unmoored in reality, are continuing to be produced and generated and believed in. Let me give you my favorite example, because it's the newest myth that is now comes to be believed by everyone. So if you were to Google U.S. FDR meets Ibn Saud in 1945, or Google USS Quincy, or just Google U.S.-Saudi relations, you will find out by analyst after analyst, the argument goes, that FDR, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, met Ibn Saud in Saudi Arabia in 1945, and that's where they made an agreement, or a pact, or what Tom Friedman makes fun of as the deal. Oil for security. And you'll see in my book, I send you to some websites where you can see leftist analysts saying exactly what FDR allegedly told Ibn Saud. And Ibn Saud, as long as you keep the oil flowing, we're going to arm you and protect you from your enemies, and so forth. Well, that's just made up. There's absolutely no evidence for it. And here's what I discovered, right? That happened in 1945. But for the next 50 years, no book about U.S.-Saudi relations says anything about the meeting between FDR and Ibn Saud. It's not part of the narrative. It didn't matter because, that meeting actually was about something else, about Palestine, about the problems of Palestine. So what happens? In 9/11, right? I almost sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but it's true. After 9/11, the meeting between FDR and Ibn Saud, which the Saudis love and kept, promoting as proof that Saudis and the United States have been closely allied since 1945. That, I call it a meme, basically. It gets reproduced now that in 2020, virtually every account of U.S.-Saudi relations by ex-CIA analysts, by journalists, by historians, start with a story about Ibn Saud and FDR meeting in 1945 and sealing a deal. A deal that was never made, and the claims about what was guaranteed not existing. So many people argue that the United States agreed to protect Saudi Arabia and so forth. And as I showed in my book in 2007, and repeat here, actually the United States said no. We wouldn't give the Saudi arms, and we refused the Treaty of Alliance that Ibn Saud asked for, because it would have been, too much of a political problem for FDR back at home. So these ideas are made up out of whole cloth, but now you just find them repeated again and again. And we have to challenge them. And back to your question, I think what's significant about it is, if we come to recognize that oil isn't the thing that we think it is, well, that should make arguments for anti-extractivism, keeping it in the ground, or renewable energies, or climate change questions, that should facilitate those political projects, right? Not to think that, the state and the U.S. oil companies are combined and we need the oil and so forth, but it's to argue that, we don't. It's there. We should definitely move, to a decarbonized world, and the obstacles are not the ones we imagine them to be. So that's what I imagine the book can do for the environmental movement, for instance.
Thanks a lot, Professor. In fact, I would have one more question, but you already answered it at the end of your comment, because I was a student here, and I was thinking about all this discussion about this. I think that Barry Boozan called it a stewardship, environmental stewardship, but you already talk about it, how this idea could destabilize this connection of this binomial security oil. So thanks a lot. I don't know if you want to say, have some final words if you want, but for us it was perfect. I think that everybody likes them too much because we're here almost 2 hours, 400 students. It was amazing for us. I think that Vinicius agreed with that it was very, very important for us, this discussion. And I think that for our students also, a lot of them are saying thank you a lot. It was outstanding reading and things like that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to be here with us to share a little bit of your new book. And I hope when everything passed, this COVID passed, we could arrange a new conference, but now in presence, physical presence here. So we can...
I've always wanted to visit Brazil since reading Peter Evans' Dependent Development book and reading Cardoso and Folletto. So I grew up as a dependista, and so this would be a gift.
Yeah, so you can prove our food and our here.
Take good care. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor.
Obrigado a todo mundo que ficou aí até agora. Nós vamos deixar, então, eu vou deixar essa live ainda mais uns 10 minutinhos, porque agora a Cris vai postar aqui o link para vocês, né, do Departamento de Seminários, e aí eu vou deixar aqui para vocês poderem clicar no link e fazer. Então, você tem uns 10, 15 minutinhos ainda para poder assinar a presença do seminário, tá bom? Então, um abraço, obrigado por todo mundo aí que ficou e se cuidem, tá bom? Tchau, tchau.
Até mais.